Good morning to everyone. Good to see you this morning. Good to be with you as we worship our God together. I encourage you to open up your Bibles as we study along this morning. And we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 45 as we begin to bring the study in reference to leadership to a close in regards to this study in particular. But there's a lot of things that we still can learn and grow as we look through the scriptures, and especially this important topic of leadership. As we have mentioned, our theme this year has been "Let us arise and build," as the individuals heard from Nehemiah about how God worked in his life and also with the king. And so as the people heard that, they were encouraged. And they said, let us arise and build because of it. And when it comes to leadership and building and growing in this process, Jesus lets us know in Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 28, that leadership really is about two important components, and that is humility and servitude. And Jesus shows that in these passages. As God's people, we are all leaders in our own right because we reign with him. And because we reign with him, as 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 points out, and also as you look in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6, as we reign with the Lord, and as we're using our gifts, our abilities in service to him, then we're going to be exercising leadership, because a part of that, again, is humility and servitude as we are obedient to the will of God. And especially when you look in Romans chapter 12 and look at all the abilities and the gifts that God has given us individually, what it might be that we are to use that in our service to it. And so as we had looked in Genesis chapter 30 or 45, as we will look this morning, and we were looking and examining the life of Joseph. And in examining the life of Joseph, again, we learn that leadership is this building process on those two components of humility and servitude. And there's a lot of things that is involved in that process and the development of our character. In Jude chapter 1, verses 20 through 23, that's exactly what we see, a building up on our faith. And then looking back here at the passage here, or this list concerning leadership, look at all the things that are involved in this. As we looked at the life of Joseph. And again, there's more things that could come out of the text, especially when you're looking at Joseph. Very impressive as we look at this young man develop and grow as he exercised humility and servitude in the process of becoming second in command of Egypt under Pharaoh. And we'll see some more things of how Joseph views this when we look here in chapter 45. So again, very valuable lessons. So as we begin to discuss these things, remember Joseph is with his brothers. They don't recognize who he is, and he's about to reveal himself to them. And that's where we left off. And then as you get into chapter 45, remember, Joseph has set them up to fail in order to keep Benjamin back here in Egypt. And he was going to send the rest of the brothers back to the land of Canaan, where Jacob was. And it was Judah who comes in and advises Joseph, think this thing through because of what might happen. It would bring devastation to our father. In fact, it may cause him to lose his life because of the stress and all the things that may have occurred with him. And so Joseph, what he does is verse 1 tells us that Joseph could not contain himself. He couldn't control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried, have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. But the fact is, it says that he wept loudly. He wept so loud that the Egyptians heard him. And not only that, it was heard of the household of Pharaoh, of Joseph weeping. He just could not contain. He broke down, as we would say, and he weeps uncontrollably. There are times in life when these kinds of things do happen. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with some good things that occur in our lives. We have seen God answer or experienced God answering our prayers. And good things happen to us, and we become so overwhelmed with joy, gladness. And sometimes we do. We break down and we weep and we cry over the goodness of God. And then there are times when things happen in our lives that bring about sorrow. And there too, that breaks us down, and we just can't control it, and we just weep. I'm reminded when my father passed away. I was doing well as I went about helping Mom and getting things arranged. And then it wasn't until I saw my sister that I broke down. I could not control it, and I grabbed her and hugged her as she hugged me back. And the tears just flowed. And then it happened again as I came back to get the rest of the family as we were going back to South Carolina. And I grabbed Deb, and I just could not control it. Those things happen. And this is what we're seeing with Joseph, but in reference to his brothers, this reunion that takes place. And what he does in the process of this, his brothers are standing there and they're seeing this man weep, who is a leader in Egypt. And Joseph says to his brothers in verse 3, he says, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Notice that. Just think about that. Here they had sold Joseph into slavery. They didn't know what had happened to him. And now here, nearly 20 years later, Joseph reveals himself, and they are stunned at that. As we say, they were speechless when he asked that question to them. And not only that, it says in verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Here the brothers are dismayed. The idea is they may have been terrified. Here is Joseph, the one that we sold into slavery, and now here he is in second command in all of Egypt. He could take vengeance on us. That could be very concerning. But Joseph doesn't think that way. Joseph's thought was, no, God sent me here. What are we seeing in regards to Joseph's attitude and Joseph's response to his brothers whom had sold him into slavery, and now he has a chance to take vengeance on them, but he does not do that. Instead, he reassures them. He reassures them, number one, of his trust in God. And that's one of the things about leadership. Leadership reassures trust in God. Why? Because God is the true leader. It turns our minds away from taking vengeance when wrong has been done to us. Our focus, our attention is trust or in God. That's where the mindset is. And this is what we see with Joseph. God sent me here, even though you may have meant that for evil towards me. But God is the one that has sent me here in Egypt. And we'll begin to look at some more things about that aspect. But that's what leadership does. Leadership reassures trust in God. It doesn't take vengeance. No, the focus is about God. In Leviticus chapter 19, verses 15 through 18, in the law, I want you to notice what God says to the children of Israel as they would deal with each other, as they would go about their daily lives. In chapter 19, verses 15 through 18, notice what is stated in the passages. You shall not do, or you shall do no injustice in judgment. Remember, we talked about the justice of God and what God teaches about justice, that we are to do things right. He says, you shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor beat or bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And when you see Joseph reacting the way that he did here in chapter 45, Joseph was doing the very thing that God instructed his people in the giving of the law. That's leadership. Leadership reassures one's trust in God. And not only does it reassures one's trust, but it encourages others to trust God as well. Why? Because God is the true leader. And notice the focus. The focus in verse 18 of Leviticus 19, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. This is what God teaches his people. And that's consistent with the instructions that are found in the new covenant as well. In Romans chapter 12, verses 17 here through 21, it is there that Paul writes to the Roman Christians, and he encourages them, based upon these things that we have just read in Leviticus 19, that vengeance belongs to the Lord. We are not to take vengeance. If our minds and our hearts are focused and trusting God, it changes the way that we think about these things. We will love. We will do good. We will encourage others. You need to put your trust in God because God is the true leader. And that's what we're seeing in these passages here in Romans chapter 12, verse 17. Never pay evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. There is that same statement of do no injustice. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. When we do this, we are exemplifying and acting the same way that Joseph is acting. We trust God to take care of it. And we never know the reason why some of these things have happened in our life. Yes, some of it could be our own doing. But if we're striving and doing right, sometimes things happen for a reason. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on in the text. But notice the focus, even in Romans chapter 12 here. And these passages, as vengeance belongs to the Lord. Verse 20, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Same principle that was laid out in the law there in Leviticus 19, the same principle being taught here under the new covenant for God's people. I want you to notice a passage that we talked about before. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, again, as Brother Wayne read those passages to us. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. I want you to notice the point that's being expressed in these passages. Chapter 5, and looking at verse 12 here. In verse 12, he says, "But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instructions." I want you to notice the mindset. Appreciate there. And that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak. Be patient with everyone. Now notice that. Be patient with everyone. Not just certain ones, but everyone. See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people. When we do this, we are showing that we trust God. We trust Him wholeheartedly. And thereby, these instructions causes us to focus on doing good, causes us to focus on helping one another, causes us to focus on being patient, as you and I at times need someone to be patient with us. As we slip and fall, as we encounter and we fall and we run into things, that happens. And we're taught to have that kind of attitude. Another passage along that line, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 22. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 22, the same sentiments are being expressed. But one of the major points here of 1 Peter 3, verses 8 through 22 is be a blessing. That's why God wants us to focus on that aspect. Because that's what leadership does. It reassures trust in God and encourages others to trust God. Why? Because God is the true leader. And we see that with Joseph. And as we see this with Joseph, it just really should encourage us. I'm reminded of what we see there in Acts chapter 27, verses 21 through 26. And this is where Paul is on the ship. He's headed to Rome, and they encounter a storm. And it is Paul that is encouraging and reassuring those with him, number one, of his trust in God. The one who is able to preserve life. The one who is able to protect them. And so he encourages them in those passages, chapter 27, and notice verses 21 through 26, where the apostle points out, there in verse 21, and these individuals are fearing for their lives because this storm is fierce. It's not a passerby type storm. It's one that they are caught up in. They had gone a long time without food. And I want you to notice what Paul says. He says, follow my advice. You didn't follow my advice and you set sail anyway. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Which is more important? Yeah, life. For this very night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, whom I trust, stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. See that? What is Paul doing? He is reassuring, number one, his trust in God, and then he's encouraging others to trust the words of the Lord, that they will not lose their lives. So keep your courage up. This is what Joseph is doing with his brothers. He's reassuring them his trust. And they should continue to trust in God, in spite of what they had done to him. Joseph views God did this. In Luke chapter 23, remember Jesus on the cross, where he reassures the thief. As he reassures the thief who puts his trust in him, today you will be with me in paradise. Encouraging the thief to trust God, because that's what he's doing. He trusts God as he's dying there on the cross. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 45. What else is involved in leadership, looking at the life of Joseph? As you continue in the text there, now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you told me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. In these passages, we're going to see another thought that comes out, which is connected to seeing, or connected to this reassuring of trust in God. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. And as you go on, he even talks about where they would live, so that they would not be impoverished by the famine, but that Joseph would provide for them, as verse 11 says. There I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished. Do you see what Joseph is doing here? What is Joseph teaching us about leadership? Leadership is about seeing the providence of God. Leadership is about seeing the providence of God. When you trust God, you reassure others to do the same, because God is the true leader. And you see that the position or whatever status in life I am, wherever I am, whomever I'm dealing with, the providence of God. Why? What's my purpose? And Joseph points this out in his statement to his brothers. That when it comes to the providence of God, there is purpose. And number two, there is timeliness. And that's what you see there. It is on time. It is at this point that Joseph says it's about preserving a remnant. It's about preserving life. And when he says that, he is even talking about the Egyptians as well. And then in particular, the people of God. A remnant, a promise that God had made to Abraham. In fact, when you look there in Genesis, you again see that. Now, this term providence, what does it mean? Well, when you look at providence, there is a word that's in there. And that word is provide. In Acts chapter 24 and verse 2, you do find that term. I know in the New American Standard it is worded as providence. In other translations, it's translated foresight. And when you look at it from that standpoint, what you're seeing is a looking ahead, and there is the care and the provisions that are being made in the looking ahead. And here we're talking about the providence of God. God, in his infinite wisdom, sees ahead and prepares for this event to take place in order to get the children of Israel into Egypt, where they would be preserved. Do you remember that promise that God had made to Abraham? In Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 through 16, he said that his descendants would be foreigners, or they would be strangers in another nation. And what we have seen is God pointing these things out and how that transpired. That's the providence of God. And in that, God provided that they would be preserved through the difficulty with the famine. Joseph, as Joseph says, I was sent by God. I was sent ahead for this very moment. So that when Joseph looks back at being sold into slavery, when he's put in a pit at about 17 years old, frightened young man, doesn't know what's going to happen, and then taken, and then he ends up going as a slave into Egypt, and now he's serving in Potiphar's house. He is falsely accused and then tossed into prison. So when Joseph looks back at that, as he has reassured his trust in God and sees the providence of God, it changes his whole attitude about things. That's what's going on here. And this is what we're seeing with leadership. Leadership is about seeing the providence of God. What is my purpose? My purpose is to humbly bow before God and serve to the best of my ability His will in my life. That's what leadership is all about. It's not about being a dictator. It's about humility and servitude. And Joseph brings this to our attention by the things that are being stated. We get to see this. We get to learn from it. And this is expressed, or God's providence is at work, and we see it throughout the scriptures. We see it throughout the scriptures. How about Esther? Remember Esther, who is queen in Assyria? As Esther is queen in Assyria, remember she is a Jew married to Xerxes. And it just so happened that Xerxes' wife was cast aside, and then now you have Esther that's married to him. And there is a plot to wipe out the Jews. Haman has plotted this. And as Haman has plotted this, as Mordecai, a relative of Esther, gets word of this, he contacts her and tells her, you need to do something about this. Look at verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Notice how specific this is. The king has not summoned her for 30 days, and for her to show up is the law where she could lose her life if the king does not stretch out the golden scepter to her. And they related these things to Mordecai. Mordecai, in the wisdom of seeing leadership, what's involved in this, especially when you recognize that God is the true leader. Mordecai tells him, and he replies to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. Don't think by you being quiet and sitting by and watching the rest of them be destroyed that you're going to escape as well. Those are some sobering words. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty, this position, for such a time as this. Joseph recognized that. Joseph expressed this when he was talking to his brothers. And that's the mindset. That God's providence, God will provide. God is the true leader. God is the one that decides. And Joseph recognizes this. Mordecai is pointing this out to Esther. And because of those words, Esther gains courage. You fast for me. And these words that she expresses after understanding that point, you see what's going on here. Mordecai is reassuring his faith in God. And he's reassuring and encouraging Esther to do the same. It changes the whole perspective of how we view things when we recognize this. And then she says she's going to go. She said, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. She's going to trust God in this matter. And she goes. And in the providence of God, a decree is written to where the Jews were able to defend themselves and they were not slaughtered. I look at Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. The Bible tells us about Jesus. Jesus is coming. And I want you to notice at the decision of God, God determining when the time was right. Paul writes to the Galatian brethren, he says, now I say to you, as long as, chapter 4, verses 1 through 4 there. He says, now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is an owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. So also we, while we were children, we were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. When God determined the time to send his Son, he sent him. And you can see God's providence in all of this. And you look back at the history and the background and the situation, and you can see God's wisdom in this, of God sending his Son at the right time. That was God's determination. It's God's providence at work. Here's one we don't usually think about that displays the providence of God. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. Do you remember that man who was born blind? As he's born blind and he is begging, but here Jesus meets him and Jesus heals him. But first of all, the disciples have a question to Jesus as they passed by and they saw this blind man from birth. They ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? That's the question. Who sinned? The man or his parents? Jesus' answer points out about the providence of God. God providing in the midst of all of these kinds of things that we might experience in life. Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Perfect timing. Perfect purpose. That the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. Jesus heals him, gives him sight. There are things that happen in this world. God's providence, I know, is still at work. There are some things that happened just a few days ago. There was this couple whose boat had capsized in the ocean. And it just so happened that the Coast Guard was on their routine mission. And they happened to see them and went over and rescued them. Just so happened at the time that they're going on their patrol, they're just checking around, driving, and they happen to see this couple. And they rescue them. And I'm sure there are instances where individuals may have capsized and the patrol, they did not find them, even though they went out and searched and lives were lost. And why is that? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know why some survive. I don't know the reason behind that. And why some lives are lost, I don't know. But I do know that God is still at work in his creation. And I know and I trust that whatever decision he makes is going to be right and timely. I can't explain those things. But I have to be like Joseph. I have to reassure my trust in God. And I have to encourage others to trust God. Then I must recognize God's providence still at work. Even if it may be that I am the one that may be in a situation like that and I lose my life. Or it may be that it doesn't work out as I may have planned and how others may have planned and it works out in their lives. I still have to trust God. And I still have to encourage others to trust God. And I must still recognize that God's providence is still at work. You see, it changes the perspective. It changes the attitude. It changes the outlook. That's why seeing the providence of God, you have to see and notice it is very important. It affects the way that we look at things and causes us to put our focus in loving and carrying out the will of God in our life. See, it prevents bitterness. Joseph could have been bitter about what his brothers did to him. Joseph could have been bitter about all the things that he went through. And what would have happened? It would have blinded Joseph to God's providence. Would have blinded him to that. Instead, he would have been set on trying to avenge himself on his brothers. But when we see it from these perspectives, these things that are expressed here in these passages, it changes the outlook. In Isaiah chapter 38, Hezekiah, remember Hezekiah where he is told he's going to die? And Hezekiah talks about his life being bitter. He was wondering about. See, that's what bitterness does. It causes you to wonder about. Because you wonder about wasting life, wasting time. He said it was leading him to nothingness. In other words, destruction. But he prays to God, and God answers his prayers. There were others who were dying, and God, they died. Why? You think about someone like Josiah, tender-hearted, goes up against Pharaoh Necho, gets shot, a fatal wound, he dies. Why? I don't know. Yeah. But here's Hezekiah. He lives another 15 years. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 29 to 32 says, this kind of attitude, it leads to destruction. That's what it does. That's why it's important for us to see the providence of God, see the provisions that God has made for us. And one of the ultimate provision that he's made is for us to be in a right relationship with him. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. Paul says the idea of bitterness, he says, or the writer of Hebrews says, you pursue peace and sanctification. Without, you won't see God. I'm telling you, if we look at it from the perspective of God, what God intends and teaches us to do, we will see him as Joseph saw God's providence. So the Hebrew writer says not only that, but it defiles an individual. And if it defiles you, you're not going to see God. So it's important to see things from that perspective of what we see in Joseph and this idea of leadership and what it's all about. The components, humility, and servitude. Again, a good example. In John chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, when Jesus heals the blind man, all they could think of was the Sabbath day, that he did it on the Sabbath day, and that this man is not worthy to be considered for such. And they were arguing over that, trying to destroy the man instead of rejoicing at the fact that he was born blind and now he sees. That was his mindset. I know I was blind, but now I see. I don't know who he is. I think he's a prophet. But I like to get to know him. And Jesus converses with him and reveals to him who he is. They were focused. They were blinded because they didn't see the providence of God. They didn't reassure their trust in God. They reassured their own trust, their own power, position. That's where it lies. And so, the encouragement for us when it comes to leadership, let us reassure our trust in God and also assure others to trust God as well, because he's the true leader. And see his providence. See God at work in our world. And as you see God at work in our world, it will encourage you, even if you end up being on the other side of it. You still have a home in heaven. It's important. You have a right relationship with the Lord. If you will, bow with me in a word of prayer. Our merciful God and Father, thank you for what you have done to us and for us. Help us, Lord, to see these things as we ought to. Help us to apply the humility and serve with our whole heart to the best of our abilities that you have so gracefully granted us. Forgive us, Lord, when we have not done what we are supposed to do, that we neglected to trust you. Help us, Lord, to do better. Help us to grow in our faith. Help us to build on that most holy faith according to your will. That we will be pillars in the community, encouraging others to put their trust in you before it's everlasting too late. It is through Jesus that we give you thanks, praise, honor, and glory. Amen. The providence of God is still at work. How do I know that? In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, his ministering angels or servants or spirits are around us working out for those who would inherit salvation. That was the encouragement of the Hebrew Christians. That same encouragement is for us today. That God is still active in our world. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, where Paul writes and he says, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." That's why I say God is still at work in this world and with us as we continue to follow his will. And the ultimate provision that God made was where you and I could become children of God. We could be saved from the destruction of sin by hearing the gospel, hearing who Jesus is, what Jesus provides for us, believing in Jesus and his provision to deliver us from sin, repenting from sin, turning away and turning to him, confessing Jesus as Lord, ruler, and master, and then being buried with him in baptism, where our sins are washed away. We are now a child of God. And as we continue to walk in newness of life, serving him to the best of our abilities, heaven is ours. It is guaranteed by our Father. by raising Jesus from the dead. And so this morning, if you haven't put on Christ, we encourage you to do so before it's everlasting too late. We're here to assist. And so if we can assist you in your obedience to Christ, we encourage you to come and make it known as we stand and sing the song indicated.
There's a great day coming, a great day coming, there's a great day coming by and by, when the saints and the sinners shall be parted right and